Robert Mugabe was born on February 21, 1924, at Kutama, a Jesuit missionary located in what is now Zimbabwe, but was then Southern Rhodesia. His father, Gabriel Madibiri, worked as a carpenter and was part of the Zizuru clan of the Shona tribe. Gabriel's father had been a powerful local chief during the 19th century. However, the family faced challenges and lost their high status due to colonial rule. Robert's mother, Bona, was a teacher of Christian lessons at the Kutama mission. Robert was one of 6 children in the family. His siblings included 3 brothers, Michael, Raphael, and Donald, and 2 sisters, Bridget and Sabina. Life was not easy for the family. In 1930, when Robert was just 6 years old, his father had a dispute with the Jesuits, and the family was asked to leave the Kutama mission. This forced them to move to a nearby village. Despite the challenges, Robert and his siblings were allowed to continue their education at the Kutama mission, even though it required them to walk long distances. Tragedy struck in 1934 when Robert's brother Michael died after eating contaminated maize. Soon after, his father abandoned the family and started a new life with another woman, leaving Robert's mother to care for the children on her own. Despite these hardships, Robert proved to be an excellent student. Teachers and classmates remembered him as serious and hardworking. One priest, Father Jerome Ohea, mentored Robert and taught him about struggles for independence, which later influenced his political views. The land we now call Zimbabwe was once known as Southern Rhodesia. It was colonized by the British in the late 1800s, during a time when European powers were dividing Africa among themselves. Southern Rhodesia was named after Cecil Rhodes, a British businessman and politician who played a big role in expanding British territories in Africa. Rhodes dreamed of building a British-controlled land stretch from Cape Town in South Africa to Cairo in Egypt. While this dream did not fully come true, he managed to take control of large parts of southern Africa. By the early 1900s, Southern Rhodesia was home to 2 main ethnic groups, the Shona majority and the Ndebele minority. Before British colonization, these groups lived independently. However, when the British arrived, they took over the land and gave it to European settlers to create large farms. This left many Shona and Ndebele people without land and created ethnic tensions that would last for decades. In 1923, Southern Rhodesia officially became a British colony. This meant the British government had full control over its administration. By the time Robert Mugabe was born in 1924, the colony was under strict British rule. The settlers, who were mainly white, held most of the power, while the black majority had little to no say in the government. This unfair system set the stage for future conflicts as the people of Southern Rhodesia began to demand independence and equal rights. Robert Mugabe's education journey began at the Kutama mission, where he stood out as a serious and hardworking student. Despite facing many challenges in his early life, including his family's struggles and his father's departure, Mugabe's determination to succeed never wavered. In 1941, he was accepted into a teacher training program at Kutama College. After years of study, he earned a teaching diploma in 1945. Mugabe spent much of the late 1940s and early 1950s working as a teacher. He traveled across Southern Rhodesia and even ventured into South Africa to teach at various schools. During this time, he also continued his own education. In 1952, he graduated from the University of Fort Hare in South Africa with a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and English Literature. This university was significant, as it had also educated future African leaders like Nelson Mandela. The years following the Second World War were a time of change in Africa. Many colonies began demanding independence, inspired by countries like India, which gained its freedom from Britain in 1947. Mugabe was deeply influenced by these movements during his time in South Africa, where he interacted with people discussing ideas of freedom and equality. In 1958, Mugabe moved to Ghana, the first African country to achieve independence from European colonial rule in 1957. His experiences in Ghana shaped his political beliefs. He admired the nation's progress under Kwame Nkrumah's leadership and embraced ideas of nationalism and Marxism. It was during this time that Mugabe met his future wife, Sally Hayfron, who shared his political ideals. By 1960, Mugabe returned to southern Rhodesia as a committed African nationalist ready to fight for independence. By the early 1960s, the political environment in southern Rhodesia was becoming more tense. Robert Mugabe returned to the region in 1960 with strong beliefs in African nationalism. He quickly joined the National Democratic Party, a group fighting for independence and equal rights for the black majority. However, this party was banned by the colonial government in late 1961. Determined to continue the fight, Mugabe became involved in a new political party called the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU. Led by Joshua Nkomo, ZAPU aimed to gain independence through peaceful methods. However, divisions within the party soon emerged. Mugabe and other members believed that peaceful negotiations were not enough to achieve their goals. In August 1963, Mugabe and several others left ZAPU and formed a new party called the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU. This group was committed to achieving independence, even if it meant using violence. Mugabe became ZANU's first Secretary General. The colonial government, dominated by the white minority, viewed these nationalist movements as a threat. In December 1963, Mugabe was arrested for speaking out against the government and promoting ZANU's cause. Initially sentenced to 2 years in prison, his detention was repeatedly extended, resulting in Mugabe spending a total of 11 years behind bars. During his imprisonment, Mugabe faced harsh conditions but remained committed to his cause. He used his time in prison to educate himself further, earning multiple degrees, including a master's in economics and 2 law degrees. Mugabe also taught his fellow prisoners and secretly sent messages to ZANU members outside, helping to guide the party's activities. Despite the challenges, Mugabe's leadership and determination strengthened ZANU's influence. His time in prison solidified his reputation as a key figure in the fight for independence, setting the stage for his future leadership. The journey to Zimbabwe's independence was marked by years of struggle, including the devastating Bush War. In the early 1960s, tensions between the black majority and the white minority government in southern Rhodesia escalated. In 1965, the white-led Rhodesian government, under Prime Minister Ian Smith, declared independence from Britain without consent. This move, known as the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, aimed to preserve white minority rule and triggered international condemnation. By the mid-1960s, the black nationalist movement became more determined to fight for independence. Both the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, led by Robert Mugabe, and the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo, sought to end colonial rule. However, the two groups had different strategies and often disagreed. While ZANU focused on rural areas and guerrilla warfare, ZAPU concentrated on urban areas and diplomatic efforts. The Bush War officially began in the late 1960s and intensified throughout the 1970s. ZANU and ZAPU, along with their military wings, launched attacks on Rhodesian forces. Mugabe, who was released from prison in 1974, became the leader of ZANU-PF, a faction of ZANU committed to armed struggle. From bases in neighboring Mozambique, Mugabe directed guerrilla fighters who targeted the Rhodesian military and white-owned farms. The war took a heavy toll on the country, with thousands of lives lost and villages destroyed. The white minority government, although supported by South Africa, faced growing isolation from the international community. The United Nations imposed sanctions and global pressure mounted for a peaceful resolution. In 1979, after years of conflict, the British government organized peace talks at Lancaster House in London. The negotiations brought together all parties involved in the conflict. After months of discussions, an agreement was reached. Southern Rhodesia would transition to majority rule and hold democratic elections. In 1980, Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF won the elections with overwhelming support. On April 18, 1980, the country gained independence and was renamed Zimbabwe. Mugabe became its first prime minister, marking the end of colonial rule and the beginning of a new era. Robert Mugabe became the first prime minister of Zimbabwe in April 1980, marking the start of a new chapter for the nation. One of his initial goals was to bring stability and unity to the country, especially between the black majority and the white minority. Mugabe called for reconciliation, assuring white farmers and business owners that they would not lose their land or livelihoods. This approach aimed to maintain the economy, which heavily depended on white-owned agricultural plantations. In the early 1980s, Zimbabwe experienced economic growth. International sanctions imposed during the colonial era were lifted and global markets reopened to the country. Agricultural exports flourished, and the government generated significant revenue from taxes on white-owned farms. The economy grew rapidly, with the gross domestic product per person increasing by almost 20% in just 2 years. Mugabe's government also invested heavily in social programs. Hundreds of new schools were built, and healthcare facilities were expanded. As a result, literacy rates improved and access to basic healthcare increased. However, these achievements came at a cost. The government borrowed large sums of money from countries like Britain and the United States to fund these programs. By the mid-1980s, economic challenges began to emerge. Zimbabwe's population grew rapidly, leading to high unemployment rates. Additionally, corruption within the government became a major problem. Many officials enriched themselves at the expense of public funds, and the borrowed money was often mismanaged. Despite initial successes, Zimbabwe's economy started showing signs of weakness, with rising debt and growing inequality. These early challenges foreshadowed the economic troubles that would plague the country in the years to come. While Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, tensions between the Shona and Ndebele ethnic groups quickly became a significant issue. The Shona made up about 70% of the population, while the Ndebele accounted for roughly 20%. Robert Mugabe, a member of the Shona group, led a government dominated by Shona officials. This created fear among the Ndebele community that they would be marginalized. The situation worsened when some members of the Ndebele group, many of whom supported Joshua Nkomo's Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, refused to disarm after the Bush War. In late 1980 and early 1981, armed uprisings occurred in Matabeleland, the region where most Ndebele people lived. The discovery of hidden weapons in 1982 further heightened tensions. To address these uprisings, Mugabe's government created a special military unit called the 5th Brigade. Trained by North Korean advisors, this brigade was deployed to Matabeleland under the name Gukurahundi, a Shona term meaning the early rain that washes away the chaff. Beginning in 1983, the 5th Brigade carried out brutal operations, targeting anyone suspected of opposing the government. Thousands of Ndebele men, women, and children were arrested, tortured, or killed. Entire villages were destroyed, and many survivors were displaced. In one of the worst incidents, 62 people were executed by the 5th Brigade on the banks of the Kiwo River. By the mid-1980s, an estimated 20,000 Ndebele people had lost their lives in what is now recognized as the Gukurahundi genocide. The violence ended in 1987 when Mugabe and Nkomo signed a unity agreement merging ZAPU and ZANU-PF into one party. However, The scars of the genocide left deep divisions within Zimbabwean society and cast a dark shadow over Mugabe's legacy. As the 1980s progressed, Zimbabwe's economic challenges deepened. While the early years of independence brought growth, the government's borrowing and mismanagement began to take a toll. Corruption became widespread, with officials enriching themselves instead of focusing on improving the country. By the early 1990s, Zimbabwe's economy started to decline rapidly. One of the key issues was the government's failure to address unemployment and rising poverty. As the population grew, job opportunities became scarce, leaving many Zimbabweans struggling to make ends meet. Efforts to boost local industries were undermined by poor planning, lack of investment, and inefficient policies. Another significant problem was Zimbabwe's growing international debt. Mugabe's government borrowed heavily during the 1980s to fund social programs like education and healthcare. However, as the economy weakened, it became harder to repay these loans. The government's inability to meet its financial obligations strained relationships with international lenders and other countries. In the late 1990s, Zimbabwe's land reform policies further worsened its economic situation. The government began redistributing land owned by white farmers to black Zimbabweans. While the goal was to address historical injustices, many of the new landowners lacked farming experience. This led to a sharp decline in agricultural production, which had been a key driver of the economy. Zimbabwe's isolation from the international community grew as these issues escalated. Countries like Britain and the United States criticized Mugabe's policies, and international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund withdrew support. By the early 2000s, Zimbabwe faced hyperinflation, food shortages, and widespread unemployment, marking the start of one of the worst economic crises in its history. By the early 2000s, Zimbabwe's economy was in free fall. Years of mismanagement, corruption, and poor policies led to one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in modern history. Prices for basic goods rose so quickly that Zimbabwean currency became nearly worthless. At its peak in the late 2000s, inflation was estimated to have reached over 1 million%. People were forced to barter for goods or rely on foreign currencies to survive. Political struggles also intensified during this time. In 2002, Mugabe faced growing opposition from the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, led by Morgan Tsvangirai. The MEDC gained widespread support among Zimbabweans frustrated by economic hardships and political repression. However, elections during the 2000s were marred by violence, voter intimidation, and accusations of fraud. The turning point came in 2008 when Mugabe lost the first round of the presidential election to Tsvangirai. Despite this, Mugabe refused to relinquish power. The second round of voting was overshadowed by violence against MDC supporters, forcing Tsvangirai to withdraw. Mugabe retained the presidency, but international criticism and sanctions against his government increased. By 2017, Mugabe's grip on power began to weaken. His dismissal of Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, seen as his likely successor, sparked outrage within his own party, ZANU-PF. In November 2017, the military intervened, placing Mugabe under house arrest. After weeks of political pressure, Mugabe resigned on November 21st, ending his 37-year rule. Mugabe's fall marked the end of an era for Zimbabwe. While some viewed his resignation as a chance for renewal, others remained skeptical about the future under Mnangagwa's leadership, given his close ties to Mugabe's regime. Robert Mugabe's legacy is one of great complexity and sharp contrasts. On one hand, he was a revolutionary leader who played a pivotal role in ending colonial rule and achieving independence for Zimbabwe. Mugabe's early years in power saw significant investments in education and healthcare, which improved literacy rates and access to basic services. Many Zimbabweans viewed him as a symbol of African nationalism and resilience. However, Mugabe's later years as a leader were marked by authoritarianism, economic decline, and human rights abuses. His refusal to relinquish power, even as Zimbabwe faced hyperinflation and widespread poverty, tarnished his reputation. Policies such as land redistribution, while aimed at addressing historical injustices, were poorly implemented and caused severe economic damage. Mugabe's relationships with the international community also became strained over time. Initially respected as a leader of a newly independent nation, he later became a symbol of dictatorship and corruption. His use of violence against political opponents and suppression of dissent created deep divisions within Zimbabwean society. On a personal level, Mugabe was a man of contradictions. He was deeply educated and held multiple degrees, yet his policies often lacked practical solutions to the country's problems. While he spoke passionately about the empowerment of his people, many of his actions enriched a small elite while the majority suffered. Mugabe's death in 2019 left Zimbabwe struggling with the legacy of his nearly 4 decades in power. His story raises important questions about leadership, power, and the challenges faced by post-colonial nations. What do you think about Robert Mugabe's legacy? Was he a freedom fighter who lost his way? Or do his later actions overshadow his early achievements? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful stories. Thank you very much for watching.